गुड मॉर्निंग एक बार फिर से दोस्तों, वेलकम बैक। ये है मैं मॉर्निंग्स विद मनी। हम हैं आपके मेजबान मनी, और जैसा कि मैंने आज शो की इब्तिदा में ही बता दिया था, हमारे खास मेहमान हैं रामचंद्र गुहा, जाने माने पब्लिक इंटेलेक्चुअल, हिंदुस्तान के राइटर हैं, हिस्टोरियन हैं, तजिया निगार हैं, और आपकी हाल में छपी है किताब स्पीकिंग विथ नेचर, द ओरिजिन्स ऑफ इंडियन एनवायरमेंटलिज्म। ये किताब आई है। आपने एक चीज जो आपने शायद अपने पीएचडी थीसिस के बाद छोड़ दिया था, उस पर आपने दोबारा रिविजिट किया है। हिंदुस्तान की इन्वायरमेंटलिज्म की ओरिजिन्स क्या है, और बहुत इंटरेस्टिंग ये किताब है। आइए राम गुहा को खुशामदीद कहते हैं, फोन लाइन पर हमारे साथ जुड़ गए हैं। गुड इवनिंग राम, बहुत शुक्रिया आपने ज्वाइन किया। थैंक यू सो मच।
Thank you.
Lovely speaking with you. Ram, you have tried to argue against the assumption that developing nations are too poor to be green.
Yes.
And you say that, well, India can show an alternative, and this thought was there even during the freedom movement. Do you want to
Yes.
elaborate on that, please?
Yes. So, Mani, we were colonized by the British. And the British brought, among other things, the large factory system. They had industrialized and, their cities had grown, their factories had grown. They had moved their population from the villages to the urban centers, their economy from agriculture to industry. And these industries were very centralized. There were massive factories employing thousands of people using fossil fuel, having tremendous environmental implications and so on. And when these methods of production came to India, some Indians, among them Jawaharlal Nehru and Subhash Chandra Bose, thought that we should emulate them, that the way to become strong like the West was to industrialize in the same manner, to exploit resources in the same manner. So that was the dominant view among the Indian nationalist leaders. But there were some dissenters like Rabindranath Tagore and Mahatma Gandhi who said, no, we have much higher population densities than the West. Our ecologies, our environments are much more fragile, and we don't have access to colonies. So we have to live within our own resources. Of course, we have to emancipate people from poverty. We have to provide them health, education, livelihood, but we have to do it more responsibly and with the understanding of the natural limits that our environment places upon us. So they were preaching a form of environmental sustainability, really from the late 19th century, but their views were not heeded because, you can understand why people like Nehru and Subhash Bose particularly, and others too. I mean, the whole younger leadership of the national movement was enchanted by the dream of massive factories, steel mills, power plants, nuclear energy, and with very little regard to the environmental devastation and social dislocation they would cause. So these thinkers were ignored after 1947. These early environmental pioneers were ignored, and their ideas were forgotten until the 1970s, when with the birth of the Chipko movement, you had a kind of new environmentalism. And that carried on for a decade or two, and then that too petered out. And now you have what I call a third wave of environmentalism, which is, of course, the climate change crisis, which has made all of us, aware that there is a problem with how we use and abuse nature.
Ram, you talk about the Chipko movement, and this was a really pivotal movement. I was a child, and I remember very vaguely about it. But whenever Chipko movement or Narmada Bachao Andolan are talked about in the press as well as in the mass media, there's almost a derisive attitude towards these movements. That, well,
Yes.
look, these are hindrances to growth, progress, all of that, right? And
Yes, yes.
I think for many decades now, during my years in the press for sure, we saw that there was a systematic attempt to somehow dismantle this notion that this kind of activism is needed for India.
Yes.
What
Yeah.
lessons do we have we learned any lessons from the freedom struggle and from all
No,
these thinkers that you talked about?
I think now with climate change, we are slowly learning the lessons. Essentially, Mani, it was a very false dichotomy when we were asked to choose between environment and development. Now, the only meaningful, sustainable development is environmentally responsible as well as socially inclusive. And, what the Chipko movement was saying was, they were not saying keep the forest locked up forever. They were saying, no, use them wisely. Use them for the benefit of the local community. Don't let the Himalayan forest be pillaged to service factories far away. who will be so insensitive to how they manage the forest that they will lead to soil erosion and floods. The Narmada Andolan was saying if you build a large dam which will benefit one state, in this case Gujarat, the cost will be paid by another state, Madhya Pradesh, where 100,000 Adivasis will be displaced. So how is this sustainable? So, and if you look at, and I think this is also a class issue. It's an issue of how environmental degradation affects the poor most. If you take the issue of air pollution in northern India. Now, one of the misnomers is that it's only Delhi that suffers from air pollution in October, November, December. It's actually every city in northern India where people choke. And it's the poor who choke. They have air-conditioned cars. It's the working class who live in slums, who don't have access to air purifiers, who travel in public transport or who take a cycle. And I think they are exposed to the tremendous adverse health implications of such high levels of air pollution. If there's chemical contamination of a river, it means the villages living near the river don't have access to clean water. Again, the wealthy can get piped water, they can get purified water, they can pay for it. So environmental sustainability is also absolutely in the interest of social justice. And as I said, you are speaking to me from Canada, Mani.
Yes.
Now, if you look at the continent of North America, it was, when the Europeans went there, it was very sparse and resource rich. And they exterminated the native population, largely, or subdued them, and occupied this resource abundant, sparsely populated continent, colonized it, and erected a large urban industrial economic infrastructure. Now, Gandhi said in the 1920s, he said, we cannot emulate the European or American model because India has no colonies to conquer. Will we take over Africa? Will we take over the moon? So I think these were the kind of lessons of prudence and responsibility. These are the warnings that people like Gandhi and Tagore offered us, which are documented in my book, and some lesser known people who are writing in that vein. And now they've come back to haunt us. If you look at us today, I've talked about air pollution.
Yeah.
If you look at water pollution, all our rivers are biologically dead. All over, your audience would know that in the Punjab, which is the breadbasket of India, groundwater aquifers are rapidly depleting.
Right.
The soils are extremely toxic because of overuse of fertilizers and chemicals. And all this is raising a real question mark about how sustainable this is. So the false choice that between the alternative environmental versus development is a false, pernicious, misleading opposition. We have to blend environmental sustainability, environmental concerns and sustainability in our development process.
When we talk about environmental sustainability, and there has been some effort to teach this in schools as well in India, but then we see a lot of tokenism when it comes from the political leadership also. You go and plant a tree, a sapling somewhere at the inauguration of some event and you are done with it. But do you think with climate change denial also happening at several levels now, and you do have politicians in India who keep talking about things like that, we have some of them over here in Canada as well, that really impacts the process, and somehow those narratives are more popular among the people. What do you think is a way to counter that?
You're right. There is a paradox. So on the one hand, there is much more environmental education in schools. When I was in high school, or maybe high school, these things were not taught. Now the young kids are aware of the various dimensions of the problem. There's a global climate change debate. That's on the one side. On the other side, as you point out, the political class is indifferent or hostile to these issues. And I would underline that this is across parties. The Modi government may be the most anti-environmental government India has ever had, but the Manmohan Singh government was scarcely any better because they were also growth at all costs, fossil fuel exploitation at all costs, mining at all costs, large infrastructure projects at all costs, even if they devastate the landscape and dispossess people. This is true of smaller regional parties as well. For example, there's this famous or notorious case of a report written for the Ministry of Environment by a finest ecologist, Professor Madhav Gadgil, about the Western Ghats, which outlined the plan about how you should really be very careful in what you plan in this very fragile and sensitive mountain zone. Where can you have where should you locate resorts, where should not locate resorts, how the roads should be built, where mining should not be permitted. And this report was ignored all across the board by the communists in Kerala, by the DMK in Tamil Nadu, by the Congress in Karnataka, by the BJP in Goa and Maharashtra. And you had these floods in Wayanad and landslides and massive environmental human suffering. So every political party is insensitive to these questions.
We do see a lot of talk about there being environmental consciousness in our mythological epics as well, and some authors have tried to bring that out. Recently, I spoke with someone who has done that with the Ramayana, at least one version of the Ramayana. There's a lot of talk about mythology here, but Gandhi, we know, was somewhat worried about colonial modernity. And perhaps he did this as an alternative, that we need to find more Indian ways. You talk about livelihood environmentalism as a contrast to a full stomach environmentalism that is practiced in the West. Is there really a need? Now, Gandhi has been gone for like decades, like more than 75 years.
Yeah.
Does it make sense to look back and see what some of the things that he was saying about environmentalism and people like him?
No, I think Gandhi was a cautionary voice. You're right. He lived a long time ago, so we have to look at the present. But the contrast between full stomach environmentalism and livelihood environmentalism is a very important one. And it's not merely a north-south contrast. There is a full stomach environmentalism in India. With economic liberalization, the growth of an affluent middle class, you have people saying, where I live in Bangalore, every Friday and Saturday you'll find SUVs going out to the national parks near Bangalore, Nagarhole, Bandipur, Mudumalai, and, basically petrol guzzling vehicles, people living luxurious lifestyles, affluent families would go for a day, season their life in the wild, take a photograph of a tiger or an elephant, come back and resume their destructive lifestyles and think they're environmentalists because they just go for a day. Whereas livelihood environmentalism is of those communities, peasants, pastoralists, fisher folk, tribals, who live with nature, who know that nature sustains them, and it has to be any destruction of nature, whether it be air pollution, water pollution, forest degradation, will affect their community life and their survival prospects. So the same thing actually. And in North America, there is what's called the environmental justice movement, because you have a wilderness-loving suburbanite population who, like the Indian upper class, will go once in a while to a national park, will drive 1,000 miles to Yellowstone to spend 3 days there, or in Canada also there must be beautiful national parks. So that's one kind. But on the other hand, you have, as studies by scholars have shown, you have polluting factories and incinerators sited basically in Hispanic and black areas. So they bear the brunt of environmental degradation. So there is a reason there, what's called an environmental justice movement, which is opposed to this, the wilderness lovers who season their life with nature, 1 week in a year, while not caring about the consequences of their consumerist lifestyles for the rest of the year. So I think that is a very important distinction between livelihood environmentalism and full stomach environmentalism, which in some ways, of course, livelihood environmentalism is inspired by Gandhi, because it's living within your means. It's showing some concern for the fellow members of your human species, often for the non-human species. It's also about, local control of natural resources. I mean, Gandhi was a sharp critic of over-centralization. But obviously, Gandhi can't give you a charter or a road map, or, he can't tell. I mean, he lived, as you say, he lived a long time ago. But I think some of his philosophical ideas and, maxims are still relevant.
Ram, let's imagine that Narendra Modi asks you someday. I mean, I don't think that's going to happen, but let's imagine there's a hypothetical situation where Narendra Modi or somebody from his government asks you, what are the 2 things that we can take away from your book that we can implement and make our environment better, make better policies for environment? What would those 2 things be?
You see, Mani, I don't believe a writer like myself or a historian should get into policy advocacy and should certainly not be a Rajguru. I think I'm fortunate I live in Bangalore, which is 1,000 miles from Delhi, because there's no temptation of being a Rajguru, unlike intellectuals in Delhi who want to hang around. It could be Narendra Modi, it could be Rahul Gandhi, it could be Arvind Kejriwal. I mean, the closer you are to the center of power, more the temptation to play the role of a Rajguru. But I'd say this: that one difference between when I was a young scholar in the 1980s and now is that in these 40 years, we've accumulated a great deal of scientific expertise. So in our universities, in our research institutes, in our IITs, we have outstanding scientists who will tell you how to solve the problem of air pollution in northern India, how to manage water pollution, how to move towards more sustainable, less chemicalized agriculture, who will help you design that are sustainable and equitable. Yet this large reservoir of scientific expertise across India is never consulted. If there's a new infrastructure project in Mumbai, the state government, whether it is BJP or Congress, Mahayuti or MVA, is not going to ask the outstanding scientists at TIFR or IIT how to go about it. They'll look at the contractor who will give them the best deal and sign a contract with him. Right. So I think this is what I would urge our political class, that if this is, as was famously said, we have not, we have not inherited this, earth from our ancestors. We have inherited from our children. And we have to think of our children and our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. And thinking in the long term, and we do have, as I said, outstanding environmental scientific expertise, whether it be forests, soils, water, housing, energy, transportation. In all these sectors, we have over the last 4 or 5 decades developed outstanding intellectual capital, which the political class must tap into.
Ram Guha, it is such a pleasure speaking with you. We sincerely appreciate your time, and good luck with your book.
Thank you, Mani. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mani. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mani. Thank you so much.